Hey guys, what's up? So, 7 string, 8 string. Do you even need this? Let's talk about it. Okay guys, so obviously I already did a video on this particular 7 string guitar. It's probably one of the best and most awesome 7 strings I've ever played. It is my own personal guitar, I own it. But since I partnered with zZounds, I've been given the opportunity to check out things that I typically wouldn't be able to, and one of the things that I picked out to kind of check out is an 8-string version of the exact same guitar. Now, you're looking at them going, well, they're not exactly the same. Well, yeah, this one's in the blue color, which is kind of cool too, because I get to kind of see if, that satin finish versus this gloss finish, if I made the right choice in that regard. Either way. What this video is not about, though, is I am not going to review these guitars or do any kind of deep dive on the specifics of this particular brand and this particular model, because I can tell you right now, they both play almost identically in terms of fit and finish. They're both phenomenally well done. I mean, in terms of production model guitars of any sort, I think these kind of take the cake. And if you go back and watch my video on this particular guitar, I think you'll see why I believe that. So what this video is really about is whether or not it would behoove you to get an extra string on your guitar, and what are the advantages and disadvantages to one over the other. Now, you might be saying, 6 strings is enough for me. Well, and in most cases, that's true. If you get a 27-inch 6-string guitar and you're comfortable with that, for your low tuning needs, great. I tend to find that there's a little bit more versatility when you add an extra string, but when you add an extra string, I'm not so sure. So let's get into it. So one of the advantages here is I have the opportunity to check out 2 seemingly identical guitars and really kind of compare my thoughts on what each one does best after getting to play with them for about a month or so. So first up, let's just talk about the obvious, thing. So the 8 string is meant to go super low, all the way down to E1 or the D1 octave. And the reason why it's probably better for that than a 7-string just out the gate is because the nut on this is already built to handle that really low, thick gauge string. If you try to do that with this guitar, the nut on this guitar kind of maxes out around 74 gauge, whereas, the low string nut on here could probably go up to an 80 or even an 85 and be fine. In both these guitars, I'm running a Stringjoy set of strings. This is kind of a custom set that I built for this guitar. This is one of their standard 8-string sets. They're pretty similar overall. The low string on here is a 64, whereas the low string on here is an 80. The 64 fits comfortably in this guitar. You could go up a little higher or a little thicker, but I don't need to because of how I have this tuned. And this is almost like the perfect set for this guitar. So the way I like to run my 7 strings, and I kind of mimicked it for the 8 string here, is I like to run a drop tuning on the first 6 strings. And in this case, I have, a drop C sharp or a D flat tuning. So E flat, D sharp to C sharp, D flat here. And then this low string here, I have tuned to G sharp, 1 octave below the 5th string on this guitar. And that allows me to do a power chord up low here and get, a big wall of sound. And then basically over here on the 8 string, what I have is the first 6 strings are an E flat standard. And then I have a low A flat to do just that 1-finger drop tuning kind of thing going on. And then similar to this guitar, I have that low string, that low 80 gauge. I'm running a low E flat 1. So when I do a power chord shape, I'm basically getting that big wall of sound just way, way lower. So these 2 guitars are very similarly tuned, only they're about, 4 whole steps difference when it comes down to the low string. So one of the things that I think when you start to dabble in the 8-string realm, your immediate thought process is, I can go heavier. Like, this makes it to where my songs, my writing, my ability to go heavy is much more improved, and I don't lose access to the upper echelon of frets. That's why these are called extended range guitars, not because they're longer scale necessarily, but because they have more notes to actually play along the fretboard. So before I get too far into, too much specifics about my thoughts on what I think, let's listen to a quick just mix back to back where I essentially play both these guitars, the same riffs. The only difference being that I'm playing the riffs on this one with that low G sharp, and then I'm basically mimicking the same pattern over here with that low E flat. And let's just see if, this 8-string makes the song heavier by being 4 whole steps lower. All right, so now that we listened to the mixes, is it heavier? Is it make it much more metal, more thal, chuggy, genty, whatever, all these words that we've come up with for these low tune kind of styles? I don't think necessarily it's heavier. It's definitely got a different, it definitely makes the song, or, your mix, your writing, the riffs, it makes the riffs sound different for sure. One thing I noticed about playing on an 8-string, whereas playing on a 7-string, even though the tensions on here aren't super off from each other given the gauges, articulation, a little bit of clarity, a little bit of ability to kind of finger notes and get them to be super clear and defined in the mix, a bit easier on the 7-string than it is on the 8-string. So one thing I can say for certain in playing those riffs is when it comes to the 7-string versus the 8-string and how you kind of have to build riffs and play them, there is a stark difference between these two types of setups. As I could tell in the 7-string mix, it's much easier to get a little bit more articulation, a little more definition, and it's a little bit easier to play quickly on a 7-string. If you try to go and do the same kind of riffing on an 8-string, the thicker string gauge, the very slight difference in tension, and just the overall, output of that thicker string going into the pickup, the clarity, the definition, it gets a little bit lost in translation, and the speed is definitely affected by what you can do. So trying to play one for one the exact same riffs on a 7-string and an 8-string, they're very different. Now, granted, you can take this down to this level. You can take it down to the same tuning if you wanted to modify the nut and do all that stuff. And then, obviously, if you put like a EQ pedal or some sort of boost pedal in front of your amp, you can get a little bit more definition out of an 8-string. And we're going to get into that in a minute when I throw it in front of my EV8 Stealth here. Okay, so first up, the 8-string and its advantages. Basically, how low can you go? And along with my EV8 Stealth, I got 2 speakers set up here, a DV77 and a Celestion Redback. And I got a few different mic configurations. I'll take a picture of that and throw it up here so you can see what it is. And I'll swap in between some of the speaker types as I play. But really the advantage of the 8-string is just how low it can go. super low, super chug, super thal, everything above. Advantage 7-string, and I already alluded to this, a bit more control over the clarity and how fast you can really utilize the lowest string on the guitar. In addition to kind of having a little bit more control and clarity over utilizing that low string, you know, it really isn't about so much the sound and so much, you know, the picking attack, because to be honest, with the 8-string, you can do pretty much everything that's I'm doing with the 7-string on the 8-string. What really it comes down to for someone to pick one of these up and automatically be able to jive with it, you know, get a good sense of what it's doing for them, is kind of in the curve, the learning curve of jumping from like a 6-string to a 7 or an 8. What I will say is when it comes down to going from a 6 to a 7, the learning curve is much softer than going to an 8. The neck, thick, you know, how wide this neck is versus how wide the 8-string neck is, kind of a noticeable difference. Going in the opposite direction, though, the low factor, and I already, you know, touched on this too, you can set up a 7-string to play as low as an 8-string, especially something like this that has a 27-inch scale. So really, the extra string is more a preference of what do you as a guitar player tend to do with your guitars. Are you just a riff machine? Are you just looking to chug away? Or are you very much set on the fact that you really want to have the full spectrum of tonality? Meaning, you can go from all the way up to not much of a lead player, but I think you get my point. You know, if you are somebody who is keen on having every single note at your disposal, you know, maybe not playing pentatonic blues licks, but, you know, and you want to have just those big low notes. Making dumb stuff up, but the point is, if you are somebody who really likes the idea of doing really fast, really high lead guitar parts, but you're also looking to kind of extend yourself down into some of these really sub-low territories, you know, an 8-string might be the way to go. And one of the things I'll say about getting any guitar, especially any extended range guitar, if you spend the money and put in a little bit of, you know, effort to picking out one that really fits your, you know, your style, your aesthetic, and one that's made well, one of the things you'll notice is the learning curve and the ability to kind of transition is much easier. So these Schecter Taos, to me, they're, in terms of production line guitars that you can just buy off of zZounds or any other retailer, they're one of the top tier ones that you can come across. And getting one of these definitely would make it easier for you to transition either to 7 or an 8. With that said, you know, 8-string guitars, they cost slightly more to maintain because string sets are a little bit more expensive. Not by much though. The pickups in an 8-string guitar will sound different than the same exact pickup that's in a 7-string or a 6-string. They tend to be wound a little bit differently. Their inductance and their resistance are slightly different. These two guitars, the pickups don't quite sound the same either, even though they're the same Schecter John Browne signature pickups. I find this 8-string pickup to be just a slightly bit darker than the 7-string in terms of kind of the frequencies that it picks up from the strings, especially, you know, these middle strings. But that's going to be somewhat across the board. 7 and 8-string pickups just tend to be a little bit different than their 6-string counterparts. In the end, what I really think it comes down to between picking a 7 or an 8-string as your go-to for an extended range comes down to your ability to want to adjust to certain parameters. Do you want to take it upon yourself to deal with the thicker or a little bit thicker and a little bit wider neck here? Adjusting your playing hand, your fretting hand to know that this low string isn't always the one that you're gonna want to default to when you're playing certain riffs. That's on you. That's on you to decide. I will say, having these couple guitars for about a month, I didn't find the transition between 7 to 8 to be super hard to do. And do you need all 8 strings? If you're a riff master, if you're really just going to be a riff writer and you're just going to be doing mostly rhythm stuff, and you're kind of one of these people who like the idea of like a baritone 6 and you've been playing one of those for a while and you just want a little bit of extra variability to play some of those more familiar chord shapes up high and, you know, get some of those high tonalities for like clean tones and stuff, I do think that a 7-string is going to be perfectly fine for that. In fact, I am more partial to the 7-string just because of the neck, how it feels, and kind of the stuff that I kind of tend to do for myself. The 7-string is perfect. When it comes down to the 8-string, if you really want some of these higher noted, you know, these higher notes up on the fretboard, and you want that full extended range, you know, go for the 8-string, try it out. If you can actually get one in your hands before you pull the trigger on it, I think that's a good idea. But at the same time, there's nothing wrong with getting an 8-string and just wanting to play caveman riffs to your heart's content. So I'm going to leave you guys with just some riffing out on these two guitars back and forth with some of these speaker choices I have here, just so you can get a feel for kind of how they sound, and I'll leave you there.
Bye.